So welcome to the final event of the conference, the Scottish Economic Society's President's Lecture, and we're delighted that Professor Danny Roderick from Harvard is giving the lecture this year. Danny is the Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy at Harvard Kennedy's Business School. He's also currently President of the International Economic Association and co-director of the Economics for Inclusive Prosperity. Danny has won many, many prizes and accolades and plaudits from inside and outside the profession. And it would take too long to list his many top papers and awards, and in this company there's no need to do that anyway. His research and policy analyses cross the boundaries of the social sciences, and his books have had a wide impact on policy discussions around the world. His newest books include Combating Inequality, Rethinking Government's Role, 2021, edited with Olivier Blanchard, and Straight Talk on Trade, Ideas for a Sane World Economy. His insights elucidate many of the very difficult challenges facing us all as we handle increasing globalization and maybe deglobalization. Anyway, as you well know, Danny is one of the most thought-provoking scholars at work today, and given the Smithian backdrop to this year's conference, given the topic of this lecture, I can think of no better way to round off this year's conference. So Danny's going to talk for about 50 or so minutes, and then we'll try and have time for questions. So it's a great pleasure to invite Professor Roderick to give the 2023 President's Lecture for the Scottish Economic Society.
Thank you, Charles, very much. It's really a great pleasure to be here. Thank you all who decided to stay until the bitter end and to listen to this. Now, when Charles asked me a while back for a title, and I came up with this title, Does Economic Policy Need a New Paradigm? I had in the back of my mind certain policy questions that I thought were going to be central in the years ahead, and I thought I was going to be talking mostly about those issues. I will, but as I was preparing my slides, it also occurred to me that I needed to spend some time talking about the central question of a paradigm. It's not a word that we use in economics much, but fish don't know they live in water. The economics that we do is actually influenced by a lot of ideas in the air. The kinds of questions that we ask are driven by concerns that tend to be those of the moment. And I wanted to therefore sort of also elucidate why the idea of a paradigm is important, particularly when it comes to questions of economic policy. Economic policies today are in a bit of a flux. You feel that a lot more on the side of the Atlantic that I come from, where President Biden has engaged in a lot of different kinds of policies that would have been really unthinkable some years back. You see those changes in terms of sort of the kinds of things that he says on trade policy, or what he says about labor market and enhancing the bargaining power of labor, with regard to big tech and regulation and antitrust policy. Probably most in sort of this new embrace on industrial policies, which were really kind of a word that you couldn't really utter in polite company, or at least in the company of economists. Perhaps you still can't. But there's certainly a kind of a very different attitude across a very wide range of policies. And that sort of raises sort of the question is, do we need to think of new ways of thinking about for economic policy? So a paradigm is the way that I think about it in the context of economics is that it's a kind of a meta model, that that we rarely explicitly articulated, let alone test. Yet the ideas that are embedded in that paradigm or in that meta-model affects how we think about the economy, its relation to society and polity, and it provides a general orientation for policy. So it's really a set of maintained assumptions, with emphasis on maintained, about sort of what do markets do well and what they do poorly. So in the technical language of economics, it's really about sort of the nature and prevalence of market failures. What is collective action and governments are capable of doing? What should they be doing? Are they able to do that? And what are sort of the binding constraints on economic prosperity and inclusion? What is the structural or institutional constraints that we need to tackle? So some sense of prioritization about what are the key problems. And they're coupled often with a kind of an implicit prioritization of values that might often be in tension. Efficiency, equity, focus at the very bottom, or things like resilience, about stability, the importance of personal freedom versus, for example, social cohesion. Okay? Those are all sort of different set of priorities or values that we might emphasize at some point or another. For a long time, of course, we've known as the science of efficiency, of course, but so much of what we do is really also about figuring out distributional effects, or in many areas of increasingly in economics, of understanding societal political consequences of markets. Now, if you want to think concretely about what a paradigm is, so here's a short list of what I think are sort of historically paradigms that economic policy has gone through. I would start with mercantilism, classical liberalism, and welfare state, socialism, neoliberalism, and there's certainly a kind of a paradigm that's attached to populism as well. I'm not going to spend time with each one of these, but just to give a certain concreteness to what I mean by a paradigm, I just want to talk briefly about three of those, of course, starting with classical liberalism. Now, we associate classical liberalism with Adam Smith, although, of course, his ideas, and that's a sort of, it's an interesting original case of how there is a kind of a slippage between economics as practiced by the professional economist here, Adam Smith, and the set of ideas that become the dominant way of thinking about policy. Because there was a central claim in Adam Smith's work about the importance of, about how private self-interest could be made consistent with aggregate performance of the economy, and the claim that the market and private initiative could be made an economic engine that drive prosperity. Of course, he also was very much interested in undoing what he thought were the economic fallacies of the mercantilists. The idea that trade surplus and accumulating gold was the main way to prosperity, even though I would emphasize that this is a strategy that many East Asian countries have followed and have done very well by. And that's because if you take certain economic structures, certain types of market failures to be more dominant than others, you can easily arrive at solutions where the mercantilism is the right way to go. So the way that, of course, Adam Smith's ideas were transformed into sort of a conventional understanding of economic policy, and it became sort of dominated economic policy, is a version that significantly underemphasized the role of complementary institutions to markets, in particular the state. So it was understood that there were a narrow range of institutions, functions that the state should provide, such as national defense, the protection of property rights, and the administration of justice. But other than that, markets should be as free as possible. Although, of course, even these sort of items are very, very narrow rendition of what Adam Smith himself believed, and I'll come to an exception later in the talk. There's a kind of classical liberalism has faded from view, but there is certainly a version of it that survives today in a kind of a libertarian vision of economic policy that I would say is fundamentally aligned with this sort of classical liberal view of how we should think about economic policy. Now, the Keynesian welfare state was a kind of a different paradigm. And of course, it grew out of the failures of classical liberalism, or the perceived failures of classical liberalism, in particular the Great Depression. And this idea that markets were not just an engine of prosperity, but they could actually sort of control and stabilize themselves, that they were self-stabilizing, was a set of ideas that I think the Keynesian welfare state consensus on economic policy rejected. And in this paradigm, in fact, the emphasis was explicitly on the idea that markets are not self-creating, they're not self-regulating, they're not self-stabilizing, they're not self-legitimizing. And therefore, you need a whole variety of complementary institutions, many of them provided by the state, whether it is labor unions, whether it's financial regulation, whether it is a sort of extensive industrial policies or extensive policies of social insurance and transfers to ensure that markets are doing what they're needed to do. So this idea that markets have to be embedded in a wide range of institutions, what I think the key insight of this particular paradigm. So there were obviously variants within, political science scholars, for example, make a distinction between the liberal versus the coordinated capitalism versions in the post-war era of this policy, that's the Europe versus US. But this was really until the 1970s, it was really the dominant view of thinking, starting from the New Deal in the United States and the rise of the welfare state in most of the advanced economies. So neoliberalism in quotes, because it's still a kind of a term that is debated. And in particular, it's very hard to find anybody who will say that he's a neoliberal these days, or maybe there wasn't any but that's why it's a quote. But again, it grew, maybe if there is I associated classical liberalism with Adam Smith, although he would dispute many of the main tenets there, associated maybe the welfare state Keynesianism with Keynes. So if there's one person that you want to associate neoliberalism with, presumably it would be Milton Friedman. Although he again would probably disagree with the way that got translated into policy. Now, neoliberalism comes out of the policy debacles of the 1970s, inflation that was driven from the supply side, the oil shocks, the sense that the welfare states had become overextended, taxation had become too high, and therefore a set of ideas that in fact Keynesianism no longer worked. Markets were overregulated and states were overextended, and therefore what policy had to focus on were essentially those three things: stabilize, in other words, responsible macro policies, fiscal prudence, monetary stability, deregulate, get the state out of the market, liberalize trade, liberalize entry restrictions, liberalize finance, remove price controls, and then privatize, get the state out of production. And those were the three key tenets. The developing country version of this model is often called the Washington Consensus. Even though this is not my topic, because I'm not going to be talking about globalization per se, the main transition made in neoliberalism with the Keynesian welfare state paradigm was really a movement towards a kind of a model of globalization that was deep rather than thin. That the thin model of globalization was associated with the Bretton Woods regime. What came afterwards, after the 1980s, was a kind of a model of deep integration, with financial integration becoming, or capital mobility becoming the norm rather than the exception. and increasingly ever deeper free trade agreements that reached beyond the borders into domestic regulatory harmonization in the names of increasing market access. Many people call the Eurozone as a sort of the apogee of the neoliberal vision, because it was essentially a model of creating a single market within Europe in finance, in goods, in services, in people, workers moving around, and leaving the sort of the project of creating the political institutions and the regulatory institutions that were needed to ensure stability and inclusive prosperity, leaving those institutions relatively incomplete and still at the sort of national level. Okay? And many problems of the Eurozone, I think, including sort of Brexit, I think is the consequence of that sort of mismatch between the extent of markets and the extent of political institutions. That still, I think, is a deep problem for the European Union. So I say all of this basically just sort of to make the idea of different paradigms a little bit more concrete. I think sort of what we want to take out of this is the idea that market economy or capitalism, in fact, can be constructed in a number of different ways. We've had different versions of what that capitalism might be, from sort of the Manchester liberalism model to sort of the Keynesian welfare state model to a neoliberal model, and could expand that range. I'm not going to talk about what the social democratic model might be, a different one, and other models that we haven't really devised yet. So if you think about all of this, it also becomes clear that ideas play a critical role in these moments of transition when there's a sense that earlier paradigms aren't doing very well, and that we need to sort of a new set of policy ideas. Here there's a kind of interesting back and forth, a mutually reinforcing sort of interactions between vested interests and ideas. So it's not just vested interest that's driving policy change, because the corporations themselves or banks themselves or powerful lobbies themselves are searching for new ideas. And you've seen sort of, you know, an explicit sort of in-depth discussion of this in this morning's lecture by Raghu Rajan, which is sort of corporations trying to figure out how is it that they're going to fit in this new world. So that gives ideas, I think, especially during this moment of transition, some significant potential role in shaping outcomes. So let me return to my question then, having spent some time discussing sort of the idea of a paradigm. Now, let me say now something that was implicit in everything that I've said, but I think it's worth making explicit. When I ask the question about paradigm, I'm talking about economic policy. I'm not asking the question whether we need a new paradigm for economics. Now, we might need a new paradigm for teaching economics. I'm glad to see Wendy Carlin here, and she and her colleagues have done a lot in terms of sort of, you know, reconceptualizing how we teach economics, which is extremely valuable. But my focus is on economic policy. And I'd like to argue that sort of thinking in paradigmatic terms for economic policy actually does not require us to think about us doing different type of economics, a different kind of economics. That's true both at the level of theory and at the level of evidence. Okay? At the level of theory, at the level of conceptualizing, of course, the fascinating thing about economics, which few people outside economics realize, is how flexible economic theory is. There's this great quote that I discovered when I was a graduate student, and that was a long time ago, from Carlos Diaz Alejandro. It says, "By now, any bright graduate student, by choosing his assumptions carefully, can produce a consistent model, yielding just about any policy recommendation he favored at the start." Okay? This was in 1974, right? You don't even need to be bright anymore to do this. So this is just easy. Maybe you can't do this with Econ 101, but certainly when you're second year studying economics, you ought to be able to do that, to understand. That doesn't mean that economics is useless. because economics is useful precisely because it specifies under what conditions, under what assumptions, a certain set of policy consequences follow. And that logic of understanding what that almost infinite variety of possible policy outcomes actually depend on is what I take to be the useful discipline of economics, understanding the if-then, the contextual part of economics. Now, because theory is so flexible, often people have then turned to say, well, theory is useless. Let's just figure out what works, and that will give us all the answers, right? So we've had the credibility revolution in economics. RCTs have become much more widely used. We have a variety of techniques from diff and diff to regression, discontinuity design to various IVs and natural experiments and so forth. So we can actually pin down causal inference much better. So if we do something, whether that worked, whether the effect obtained or not. But as we accumulate more evidence, it also becomes clear that we have this problem of sort of whether something works here is also going to work somewhere else, the problem of external validity. So there's a nice paper by Eva Wiewald that sort of looked, did a kind of a meta-analysis of micro-development interventions. And economic development is one of these areas where the credibility revolution has gone the furthest. And looking at sort of particular interventions, let's say the effect of conditional cash transfers on school enrollment, and then looking at the range of variation in the impacts that you get from different studies. And the range is huge. One number that sort of sticks out from that paper is that knowing the result of a study in one paper, you can predict the sign of the result in another paper with only 60% probability of getting it right? Random would be 50%. That just sort of raises to 60%, which is very, very low. So how do we think of that? Well, the world is complicated, and something that works here doesn't necessarily work somewhere else. Something that works here now may not work in the same place tomorrow, okay? So what that means is that even though, again, that kind of evidence, just like theorizing, is extremely important, it doesn't sort of tie down economics to any kind of particular policy preferences, policy prescriptions. Okay? So that's why I say, in some ways, these tools are essentially paradigm-free. And can really support a very large variety of paradigms. I gave you the example, mercantilism. You might think mercantilism was killed by Adam Smith, but of course not. I mean, any one of us can write a model or find evidence that certain types of mercantilism actually can be beneficial for growth and even for consumers in the long run. If there are lots of externalities in the supply side of an economy, learning by doing, and so forth. So that's just to clarify that I'm not calling for a new type of economics. I think the tools that we have are very powerful. Furthermore, if I were to argue against sort of the paradigm, I would say that perhaps just as in the examples that I've discussed, by the time any set of ideas become conventional wisdom, they turn into sort of these cookie-cutter solutions. And they tend to develop blind spots that often could render them inappropriate for specific context. And in some ways, what economics is really good at is actually being able to navigate among paradigms rather than sort of generate sort of the intellectual servant of a particular paradigm. So remember again, sort of the Carlos Diaz de Alejandro quote is to, if your political principle wants to generate a model as to what this policy is right, well, I can come up with it. I can even come up with an empirical study that supports that. So all of this is to sort of to put what I'm going to be saying next in a kind of a frame of both a certain degree of humility, but also to suggest that what I'm going to be talking about really is about is about the kind of new approaches to policy, given the context that we find in, given the challenges that we face, rather than calling for changing the way that we, we do economics. So I think, there's an issue is that we still need kind of to have an appropriate vision for policy. And if we don't do it, others will come up for it for us. So why do we need this new animating vision? I think there are real reasons to believe that we're really at this kind of a period of transition, that the world is not going to be the same. And many of the kinds of policy innovations or experiments that I started out with from Joe Biden's policy agenda are sort of an indication of this search for new solutions. Part of this is due to the fact that COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine have made us very sensitive sort of new priorities that we weren't really focused on very much. So in the case of COVID-19, public health and public health failures and resilience in our sort of supply chains when it comes to medical supplies. And Ukraine, of course, the primacy of geopolitics when it comes down to it. And geopolitics has its own logic, which is a zero-sum logic, as opposed to sort of the Smith-Ricardo logic of mutual gains from economic exchange. And of course then, but those problems are really, I would say that only exacerbate ongoing trends. So the problems with globalization and global value chains that the COVID-19 highlighted were already there. And there was a creeping backlash against globalization and a rise of sort of ethno-nationalism, which was precisely a kind of a response to many of the anxieties, economic anxieties that had been created by globalization. And with respect to geopolitics, I think the conflict, the US conflict with China was already accelerating, and it was clear that was going to come on to a head. And of course, in the background, we have the climate transition, which is the most important threat to our physical environment, to our survival, that sort of requires sort of priorities. Now, why do we need something new? I think we need something new because the existing approaches to how we sort of think about what our policy priorities, the right policy frameworks are no longer working, okay? Let me sort of, I would examine that very briefly, because I'll say a little bit more about that, very briefly under sort of three headings. One, with respect to our existing model of globalization, which I've called the post-1990 model of hyper-globalization. I think that model has been undermined by the distributional struggles that it has created within countries, with lots of workers and lots of regions within countries being left behind. It's been undermined by this sort of the salience of resilience that sort of the public health crisis has brought to the fore, and has been undermined, of course, by geopolitics. That the U.S. now regards, and increasingly Europe now regard China not as a partner in trade, but they regard them as sort of, in the case of the U.S. at least, their most important national security threat. Okay, and that makes the kind of sort of regime with with ever-expanding trade agreements and deep financial integration impossible. There are problems, of course, with the welfare state that go back all the 1970s, but I'm going to say that it's not really about the overextension of the welfare state in the sense of where will we finance those taxes, because in the US you can agree that the welfare state is too thin, and you certainly need more redistribution. But my point there is going to be less about the overextension of the state, but more about the fact that the structural labor market inequalities that we have at present are not adequately remedied by redistribution, that we need much more directly interventions in the productive sphere, much more directly in labor markets and in firms to address them. And even though I don't have much to say in this lecture about economic development proper or low-income countries, I would also say that, and that's really a fundamental issue going forward, that the standard model of economic development that we have today, which is time-tested and extremely potent, which is export-oriented industrialization or growth through integration in global value chains, that model is not working. It's not working because manufacturing industries, which traditionally have been able to absorb large amounts of labor from the countryside, large amounts of low-educated labor from the countryside, and therefore have been a very potent and broad escalator for economic growth historically. These manufacturing sectors are now increasingly capital and skill intensive, so they have turned much more into enclave sectors like minerals, which might create islands of wealth, but are not driving broad-based prosperity or dynamic growth over time. So that's a kind of a separate discussion, if you will. I'm not going to say much about that. But there is a fundamental sense in which our existing underlying sort of growth model about development policy is not working. So when I put all of these things together, I said, we need policy. Do we need a new policy paradigm? Yes, because we need a way of thinking about how we're going to be addressing these issues. So what are these sort of structural issues? So one issue is sort of this phenomenon that we've seen in a lot of advanced countries. These are from the United States, where this kind of labor market polarization, that a combination of global competition and technological change has really severely undermined sort of middle skill occupations, whether it's factory worker, a production worker, or is sales and clerical jobs that have sort of traditionally been a kind of a path to the middle class. And that sort of low pay occupations have increased, and high pay occupations, professionals, relying on professional skills and so forth, have also increased. But it's sort of the society has been sort of on this trend of being divided into sort of these two groups. And the question, the fundamental question here is what's going to sort of happen to increase demand for people with medium-skilled jobs. Interestingly, there is a discussion in the Wealth of Nation where Adam Smith discusses how technological change, in this case, the division of labor, has adverse effects on the least educated, least skilled workers, the production workers who are undertaking this very, very simple tasks. And he says, in the progress of the division of labor, the employment of the far greater part of those who live by labor, that is, of the great body of the people, comes to be confined to a very few simple operations. And then he says, sort of towards the end, his dexterity at his own particular trade seems in this manner to be acquired at the expense of his intellectual, social, and martial virtues. So that by turning the people into sort of very low-skilled production workers, you're actually undermining the possibility of developing their full human potential. Okay? And then his remedy is, where again, this is Adam Smith, he's not a classical liberal, the state has got to do something about this. He says, in every improved and civilized society, this is the state into which the labor and poor, that is the great body of the people, must necessarily fall, unless government takes some pains to prevent it. So he saw a very clear role for the government to address these kinds of what today we call labor market dualism, or sort of the labor market polarization. His remedy, by the way, was education, okay? And that is the standard remedy. But I'm going to argue that that is not adequate. It's not simply, education is always the right answer to almost every question. But the question is, how do we create jobs for the type of workers we have, not the type of workers that we'll create with enough investment in education 30 years from now? And there's always a chance that skills lag behind technology. So you have to work on the demand side of the labor market as well as the supply side. Okay. A related problem, in fact, something that's closely related to why the middle of the skill distribution in labor markets has been undermined. And now this extends the problem to developing countries, is that manufacturing has essentially has been shedding workers everywhere. So this problem of employment deindustrialization, that is a problem that essentially all countries have faced. There's this phenomenon of which I've called premature deindustrialization in middle and low-income countries, where manufacturing starts to shed workers at very low levels of income before having reached any level of industrialization that would be considered to be appropriate in historical terms. And this is a trend that I think is the employment deindustrialization is a trend that I think is going to be very hard to reverse. The US today, for example, is investing a lot in manufacturing and reshoring in the expectation that it can rebuild manufacturing. Even if it rebuilds manufacturing, the chances that it's going to reverse the decline in the employment share in manufacturing, I find very, very difficult to believe. And if you don't believe that, look at South Korea. South Korea has done amazingly well in terms of propping up production that's value added at constant prices. You can see that the red line in the chart keeps going up. But look at what has happened in employment, just keeps going down. So even when you revive manufacturing, even if you're doing really well in global competition in manufacturing, you're not doing well in employment. So this is the phenomenon of sort of the increasing skill and capital intensity of manufacturing. Now, this is important because manufacturing in developing countries has been the traditional way, or in economic history, has been the traditional way in which you build middle-class societies. Okay? Labor moves from countryside to manufacturing, starts to make much more money. They get organized, they ask for rights, and you build sort of middle-class societies. And in the advanced countries, manufacturing has been sort of the mainstay of the middle class, but that's no longer the case. So, combined, sort of these two issues of labor market polarization and employment deindustrialization, which are sort of related, are all sort of, making our societies much less capable of producing sort of a middle class. This has gone probably, the decline of the middle class has gone furthest in the United States, but also has happened in other sort of, European countries that have actually fairly good welfare states like Sweden or Germany. Okay, so this brings me to where my current thinking in terms of what this, let me not call it policy paradigm, this set of new approaches or policies that we need to put front and center. So I would say that if climate transition is the greatest threat to the to our physical existence, I think sort of the disappearance of good jobs, these labor market ills, and this middle class squeeze is probably the greatest threat to our social and political existence, because it undermines both equity, undermines sort of an inclusive economy, but undermines a lot of things that go with sort of cohesive societies and good kind of politics that we got used to, and then were sort of undermined by the shocks of the 90s, and of which things like Brexit or the rise of Trump are actually a consequence, as many papers have in the literature have shown. So I'm not going to, don't have much time, and I'm not going to be going in detail about what this might look like. And so, but all I'm hoping is that I might, sufficiently get you interested that you might want to look at some of these papers that I've written. Some of them are general, some of them focus on the United States. There's a report that we did for President Macron, which has had zero impact with Stephanie Stancheva. But so I'm just going to sketch what this is, just to give you a little bit of a flavor, and I hope to do this in 8 minutes, and not to go over my time. So we can think about sort of our policy priorities and the type of policies that we pursue by using a policy matrix of this kind. That sort of is a way of thinking about different types of policies. So we can distinguish policies, if you look at the columns, by sort of, where in the economy, in terms of what stage of the economy we're intervening. Are we, intervening in the sort of pre-production stage of the economy? Are we intervening directly in the production stage? Or are we intervening in the post-production stage? So with pre-production, what I mean are interventions that target, for example, the endowments of individuals and families. Production would be production stage interventions would be, things like production subsidies or labor market interventions or investment subsidies that directly intervene in the incentives for what you produce, how much you invest, and so forth. And post-production would be things that happen after production, after markets have closed in some sense, transfers and social insurance, or generally sort of macroeconomic policies. And then along the rows are sort of, different segments of the economy that we might be targeting because we care particularly about them. So do we care at the very low end? We're concerned about poverty. Do we concerned about the middle part of the economy? Are we concerned about sort of, the highest productivity part of the economy? And of course, policy generates basically completely fills this matrix with, all kinds of different types of policies. But I want to highlight sort of where different types of approaches focus on in terms of policies. Now, I think sort of traditional policies on growth and investment and innovation focus typically on the sort of the most productive segments of the economy and try to enhance their ability to provide sort of the end, continue providing the engine for growth. And so those might be things like, the innovation system, the system of patents or intellectual property rights, sort of, various incentives for investment and so forth. Now, I think the limits of our traditional growth policies, and I've mentioned this a little bit in the past, is that that is not directly targeting this problems in the labor market polarization, because as in my example of manufacturing, you can do really well, at the very top end of the economy. So, in the US, the most innovative firms, the largest firms have done very well in terms of profitability, in terms of innovation, but aggregate production, aggregate innovation, aggregate TFP have not done so well, because basically there's this divide that those innovations do not necessarily disseminate to the laggard firms or to workers that are not in those market leaders. So this is as much, basically this problem of dualism used to be a problem of economic development at low-income countries. The problem was that every developing country had these very high productivity segments, but the rest of the economy wasn't doing well. So this traditional, the dual economy model, the traditional versus modern segments of the economy. Increasingly, this is what characterizes rich countries, that there is this kind of a dualism between the parts of the economy and the regions of the economy. Think of London versus the rest in the UK that are not doing nearly as well, and that there is this, the polarization or the dualism persists. Now, the welfare state model actually focuses on sort of very different cells, focuses much more on sort of the low and middle income or middle productivity, emphasizes first investments in endowments, investments in education and health, also focuses then on social insurance, redistribution, so that if people fall through the cracks, that there is ex post redistribution, okay? So along with the Keynesian element of that, of course, is full employment macro policies, which can be very powerful to increase wages at the low end of the skill distribution, as we've recently seen in the United States. Now, I think the problem with the welfare state model is that that it presumes that these sort of middle-class jobs or these good jobs are going to be available to all with adequate education, and therefore it's enough to, focus on sort of the pre-production stage and then the post-production redistribution. Okay? But I think it seems to me that the kind of labor market polarization and the related problems of the middle class and inequality that we observe today is much more of a structural problem. That this inadequacy of these good jobs is driven by secular trends having to do with sort of technological changes, with the process of deindustrialization, with the kind of globalization we've experienced in the past that's not going to be reversible. And when technology and globalization hollow out the middle of the employment distribution, we end up with this kind of a structural problem that shows itself in the form of permanently bad jobs and depressed regional labor markets. And therefore, we will need a kind of a different strategy that tackles good job creation directly. And traditional welfare state policies are not adequate to address, can address at best the symptoms of the problem. Okay? So what are those good jobs policies? There are going to be interventions that target directly the productive sphere of the economy. Yes, labor training and education are important, but they will need to be much more directly connected with the productive needs of enterprises, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises that are the most likely to create the jobs that are needed. So this is going to be in this kind of a cell, this middle cell, targeting production and targeting sort of the middle productivity cell of this matrix. And so those are going to be things like, as I said, active labor market policies that are directly linked to employers. They are a new brand of industrial or regional or place-based policies that are much more targeting employment and the creation of good jobs, as much as other priorities like innovation or the climate transition might be important. I think targeting good job creation through these industrial policies requires a different set of policies targeting that particular objective. One thing that I'm particularly, I think is going to be important is rethinking about our innovation policies. And just like we think about innovation that can be more climate friendly, investing, altering the direction of technological change in a more climate friendly direction, I think we can envisage ways in which we can alter our public incentives for innovation in a more labor-friendly direction. That is, technologies that complement and augment rather than replace low and middle skill workers, and in the services particularly. And finally, a layer of policies, sort of international economic policies that are going to sort of target in line with this move away from hyper-globalization, that's our target that just like countries and make sure that their domestic regulations in the environment or in safety are not undermined by imports from countries where regulations might be much more lax, that their own sort of labor market standards and labor market policies and practices are not undermined by countries where labor rights are routinely violated. So a set of different kinds of policies at the international level as well. So sort of there are many different ways of thinking about sort of how you can do those kinds of things, and I've written about this in the references that I just gave you, and I'm just obviously just scratching the surface here. And let me just end by sort of emphasizing some of what I think are some of the high-level advantages of this kind of approach that I'm approaching. One is that it targets structure directly. That is targeting, since inequalities in the economy are shaped directly in the sort of productive sphere, these policies would target production and employment and innovation incentives directly rather than taking them as given. The second kind of element is that when you think about how best you can carry out these objectives, it's rarely in the form of a government subsidy or a government tax, this sort of top-down principal-agent model of regulation. That model of regulation actually doesn't work in these areas. You need much more collaborative, iterative models of working with the private sector, with this mass of small and medium-sized enterprises. And one thing that does is actually moves us away from this, dichotomous relation, market versus state, sort of, this going back and forth between emphasizing markets versus emphasizing government and regulation. That they actually sort of, the right way to think about it is that there is a kind of a sort of collaborative models. Third, I would say, is what I've called as the merging of the equality and the economic growth agendas. That's very important because if you're working in the sort of middle class, what you're trying to do is make it easier for that sort of middle level of the economy to become more productive. And that's been the binding constraint to aggregate productivity and growth because, as I said, the top has been doing very well. It's the low and the bottom part that's not doing well. By increasing directly the productive capacity of firms that are sort of have been not part of this winner's circle, you're simultaneously advancing the equity agenda because that's where most low and middle class people are, but you're also advancing the aggregate productivity and growth agenda because this way you actually get higher growth as well. And finally, if you want to think at in the grandest possible forms, this way of thinking about regulation and institutions and what we need to do by sort of targeting these sort of production level relationships also leads you to become very agnostic about what the long run shape of aggregate institutions ought to look like because they entail a kind of a relationship that's very open-ended in terms of what the relationship between governments and markets and business and labor ultimately ought to look like. And the benefit is that the first step you take is actually building on existing stuff. Many of these collaborative relationships already exist. You don't have to invent them. But by building on them, you can go on to a path that actually might open up significantly a path of quite radical institutional reform ultimately, even though you start from very gradualist beginnings. Okay, thanks for listening. I'm just going to stop here.
Are you okay to stay for a few questions?
Yeah.
So I think we've got 5 minutes for some questions. So if you stick your hand up, we'll get a microphone to you as quickly as possible. Here. Thank you.
And it was a very interesting talk. One thought I had was at the time of the last paradigm shift from Keynesian to neoliberal, there was a set of problems, things that were clearly wrong. But at the same time, demographics were still in quite good shape. There was a degree of financial repression, so the size of the financial sector wasn't too large. Government debt was at the lowest level we've seen since the Second World War in advanced economies. Are these not the ideal set of circumstances in which to implement a new paradigm? Whereas today we have demographics in advanced economies have turned against us, government debt's at very high levels, arguably the financial system is bloated and too large, so it's not the ideal place to start from.
No, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think my approach scores well on two out of three of what you mentioned. You mentioned demography, role of finance, and and the role of public finances. Now, so I think the reason that on demography and public finance actually, in some sense, this is what the doctor ordered, is that one thing I'm not calling for is an extension of the state in terms of expenditures. And sort of one of the problems of the welfare state is inability, of course, to keep on undertaking the kind of transfers that would be required under current levels of inequality, given our the declining working age population, and so the demographic effect. So this is saying that we can do much better by actually sort of targeting productivity of the workers at the low and middle end of the skills rather than emphasizing the transfers. So in that way, that takes the pressure off both public finances because, it takes the pressure off from public finances because I'm not saying that what we need to do is go and subsidize firms. So if you look at the bottom here, is really much more of a kind of exploration of the constraints that firms face and then removing them in a kind of contextualized way, in a customized way. It's not about subsidizing firms. In fact, I would, much of the subsidies in the US, for example, or for that matter in the European Union to firms, I think can be cut down.
It's all those kinds of demographic thing plays out. But there is very little space, very little room or capacity for them to be increasing productivity. There are no real productivity gains for them to have, and notwithstanding the difficulty of even measuring what their productivity is. So what happens for those people? What's happening to them, and where does policy need to go in relation to them?
Yeah, a great question. I mean, I do think that there is significant room for enhancing productivity in those sectors. I mean, there are two sectors. One is two large sectors that either are already very large or are large and will grow more. The care sector, long-term care in the United States and in advanced countries. The second is sort of retail. Now, we know from a variety of smaller scale interventions that if you are able to provide relatively low educated, less skilled workers in retail and in the care industries with digital tools that are able to make them perform tasks that are highly differentiated and highly contextualized to different customers' needs. That this can increase their productivity quite significantly. So in the care industry, for example, in the United States, a typical care worker has virtually no autonomy, no agency in terms of how he or she is dealing with a patient, when that patient is going to be fed, whether certain kinds of medicine can be administered, doing dressings and bandages and things like that. So we have the ability, even with the technology that we have currently, with providing them with much greater autonomy and providing services that are much more directly geared to needs of individual patients. And we know that pays off in terms of productivity because aged people who are taken better care of are much less likely to end up in hospitals where it's much more expensive, much more less likely to end up with chronic conditions. So we know that there are direct productivity benefits. But this is something that happens very haphazard in a variety of institutional and other, and there are sort of, its analog in retail would be empowering retail workers with the kind of very specific knowledge that can help them serve individual customers in a much more specialized kind of a way. So these would be the kind of services equivalent of how we increase productivity or production workers in manufacturing to the Toyota production method, where we we moved from the division of labor model of Adam Smith to the team model, or to sort of providing workers with the ability to solve problems on the production line and so forth. So there are proofs of existence of these kinds of things, but we can do much, much better if we were to think about the stream of innovation that we produce, the technology in which we invest in, particularly from the standpoint of how is this going to affect these kinds of workers? How will it affect their productivity? Can we come up with much more imaginative ones than the types of examples that I provided? So I think it's possible, but that requires an explicit reorientation of what are innovative goals. And are in the US, for example, I've called for ARPA for an ARPA-W. So we have DARPA for defense-related advanced technologies. We have an ARPA-E for renewable energy technology. I want an ARPA for workers, an ARPA-W. So investing in the kind of technologies that are particularly able to augment these kinds of skills. So that's a possibility.
Thanks. And final question here from Mary.
Yes, thank you. That was very nice. I really enjoyed that, and the Good Jobs agenda sounds like a wonderful forward-thinking way to go. If I could be gently critical, I'm not quite sure it's yet a paradigm. And I think there's what would be interesting is to think about how you want to reconceive the state market regulation. You talked about it as a collaboration, but it seems to me a little bit it needs to be more than a collaboration, but a sort of redrawing of what are thought to be the boundaries and the crossing of the boundaries over. So one of the paradigms you didn't mention, which we kind of might label economists under, would be German cameralism. And the interesting thing about that for me is that the notion of the state is completely different. And so while I'm not suggesting that's where you wanted to go, but it does seem that somehow dealing with that state market regulation space could be the space where economists can recognize a new paradigm, even if the rest of the society doesn't yet want to do that. But that for me would be one way of cashing out something to a paradigm rather than a really smart agenda.
Thank you for that comment. I think you're right, and I think you're correct to draw attention to the German model. I would say that I think sort of what I've described as this collaborative, iterative model of governance in the context of promoting productivity-enhancing employment growth, would have many similarities to the way that Germany has practiced its policies with sort of the medium-sized firms, both at the federal and the subnational level. I would basically just take many of those aspects and say now that has to be now applied to services. Okay? We think of those modes essentially having been sort of kind of for manufacturing, but the jobs of the future are going to be in services, as we were just talking about. It's really how can you take some of those same principles and apply them to areas like retail or long-term care or education, and that's really where the transition we need to make. With respect to this not being absolutely, I mean, again, I'll repeat something I said: beware economists bearing policy paradigms, and if I ever come in front of you or in front of the audience, trying to sell to you a particular policy paradigm, you should just dismiss it. So I'm very conscious of that. So I just try to outline both a kind of a priority, which I think is significant, looking at our policy configurations from the perspective of good jobs, and also sort of, because I didn't have time, I couldn't go into some of the details, some specific approaches that might advance those priorities.